that we are joined by Merissa Khurma. She's the program director of a Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much for joining us, Merissa. Firstly, I just want to get your thoughts on this dueling Hamas-Israel ceasefire claims. Now, Hamas reportedly agreeing to a ceasefire proposal, while Israel is saying the deal is far from meeting its demands. I mean, what's your reaction to these sort of contrasting positions and confusion we are seeing on this front?
I think this is very much emblematic of the back and forth that we've been seeing for the past few months. You know, back in December, when I was in the region, there were talks of probably 6 to 7 weeks of military operations in Gaza. And there was so much optimism in January for a hostage deal and a prisoner exchange and a humanitarian pause. But as we've seen in the last few months, it has not gone the way that the international community has hoped. So I think this is very much part of the negotiating process. Israel intends to go into Rafah regardless of whether there's an agreement to a deal. It's a way for the war cabinet in Israel to pressure Hamas into perhaps, acceding to more of its demands. So it is really a wait-and-see situation at this point, with very intensive U.S. diplomatic efforts, particularly through Egypt and Qatar, going back and forth with the leadership of Hamas. The other component of this is that the leadership of Hamas that the Qataris and Egyptians are talking to are not in Gaza. They are outside of Gaza. They are primarily based in the region, in Qatar, in Turkey, and other places. And those military commanders on the ground, essentially Yahya Sinwar, who's the mastermind behind the October 7th attack, is the person that they're communicating with. So this disconnect also makes it more difficult for such a deal to take place right away. But it's certainly a part of the negotiating process, both sides pressuring each other, certainly with the idea of going into Rafah. That will add a lot more pressure on Hamas.
Understood, Professor Khurma. I want to ask you about what we know about the plan. It's over 3 phases, maybe involving about 4 months or so. First phase, hostage return, IDF withdrawal. In the second phase, and then in the third phase, reconstruction. Which, in your view, is the most problematic one for Israel?
Well, for Israel, it is first and foremost about security. It's about completely destroying Hamas. It's ensuring that post-war Gaza is Hamas-free, so that it does not have to, not just Hamas-free, but truly free of any militant or terrorist group that will potentially launch a similar strike or worse inside of Israel. So for Israel, that security is its number one concern, because this October 7th attack that marks its 7th month tomorrow or today in Singapore has completely shaken Israeli society, completely shaken the Israeli government. And so this is first and foremost the most important component of it. How you move forward to reconstruction while continuing humanitarian aid as well as maintaining security, I think, is the $1 million question, because there are so many challenging components to the day after, from the sheer destruction that we have seen in Gaza, with 60% of the homes completely destroyed, particularly in the northern part. And that is where most of the people that are currently taking refuge in Rafah have fled from. So there's nowhere for them to go. And then you have the basic infrastructure that you need for just maintaining day-to-day life, whether it's the healthcare system that has been completely decimated, the schools, with children that have been out of school essentially since October 7th. So that's 7 months of no schooling. But then you have basic food and water provisions. And with this Israeli siege, we've seen a humanitarian catastrophe unfold in the Strip. And so for Israel, security is first and foremost the number one priority. For the international community that is working on the humanitarian aspect, it's about keeping people alive, especially with the World Food Program warning for months now of an impending famine that we're already seeing in the north part of Gaza, even with the very slight progress that we've seen in recent weeks with humanitarian aid being delivered at a much more robust way. But it's nowhere enough what Gazans need.
Just to follow up on your point about the reconstructing of Gaza, amidst this confusion and also with some observers believing that this conflict is likely to continue, some may ask, isn't it just too premature to even discuss plans for rebuilding the enclave? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think when you ask the Arab governments about the day after or coming up with plans for the reconstruction, the answer that you've heard just last weekend with the Arab foreign ministers in Riyadh at the World Economic Forum is that we will start talking about the day after and reconstruction, and we will do our part when we know that there's a political horizon for a two-state solution, for a Palestinian state, for Palestinian self-determination. But it is also never too early to start talking about the day after, because as the military operation that Israel has conducted so far since the October 7th attack starts to wind down, then there will be a lot on the ground to grapple with. You've been covering the war since the very beginning. You've shown and you're currently showing images of what Gaza looks like. It's completely uninhabitable. There are diseases outbreaking due to water shortages, famine, and children dying of starvation due to the blockade also that has taken place and the inaccessibility of humanitarian aid and food deliveries. So there are so many different challenges, but we have to talk about the day after, because that is the only way to resuscitate the two-state solution. Of course, it's going to take a very long time. The longer the war lasts, the more difficult it will be for Israelis and Palestinians to come together. But if you look at the recent polling of Palestinians in Gaza, those who have had enough, people have lost family members, extended relatives, friends, families have lost, children have lost their parents. There are thousands of orphan children. I think a lot of these Palestinians in Gaza are currently saying the only way forward is through diplomacy. It's through negotiations. And you've seen an uptick in support for the two-state solution. So I think that's why we need to talk about the day after. It is very challenging, and the path ahead is going to be riddled with so many different obstacles. But it is the only way moving forward for both Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in their own independent states.
All right, Professor Khurma, we do have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We've been speaking to Merissa Khurma, who's Program Director at the Wilson Center's Middle East Program.